Yo, what's up, Sci fam? It's your boy Nickel here, and next we're gonna learn about metabolism. So you can see that is the title of this video, but it's also how we're gonna start our page. So you can use this as a title, and we'll define it, and then we'll look at the three things that happen when we eat food, and we'll look at how our body then stores, burns, and builds stuff from the nutrients that we put into our body. At least a general, very general overview. So let's get into it. Metabolism. So metabolism is basically related to the chemical reactions that break down food and turn it into energy. So usually, when we talk about chemistry class, we think about like explosions that create energy, and those we see the energy in the explosion. But in this example of food going into our body and metabolizing, chemical reactions turn that food into energy. So after eating, the food enters our body, and all food is used to do one of three things. It is either going to be used to build, or burnt, or stored. So all food that you put into your body is going to help you build more stuff. It's going to be burned for energy, or it's going to be stored for later, energy for later. So let's look at this. The first thing, as we said above, is to build. So when you put food in your body, for example, when you put amino acids in your body, amino acids are the monomers, or the small building blocks that create proteins. So when you eat proteins, they get turned into amino acids, and those amino acids go into your body to build new proteins, ones our body needs. So when we eat like meat, for example, that is old parts of animals, and those animals had proteins that built that tissue that's eating that muscle, and when you eat that muscle, it allows us to build new proteins for our muscles or for other things in our body. Also, when we eat, we don't only eat proteins, but we also eat fatty acids. And fatty acids are the monomers, the smaller building blocks from fats. So when you eat fats like olive oil or butter or avocados, these fats then build our cell membranes. So our cell membranes are made out of fats, and so when we put fats in our body, we then recycle those to create our cell membranes. All right, so if we're not building stuff, then we're burning our food energy so that we can have energy. And all of our cells need energy to carry out their specific functions. So energy is really important. And so therefore, all biomolecules, regardless if it's a carbohydrate, a fat, a nucleic acid, or a protein, all biomolecules can be burned. And this is because they all contain carbon. So if you think about like a piece of coal is just pure carbon. And so when we burn coal for energy, we're just burning carbon. So anything that has carbon or is made out of carbon can be burned for energy, and our body does that. Then when we put carbon in our body in the form of food, like fats, proteins, carbohydrates, or nucleic acids. And what happens here is that we release that carbon that we put into our body as CO2, or carbon dioxide. And when we release that carbon as CO2 and carbon dioxide, our cells then capture the ATP that's also produced. Now this should turn on a little light bulb in your head, because we already learned about this in a prior unit. And remember, this is called cellular respiration. So when we eat food, that food allows our cells to go through cellular respiration to get ATP energy, and the waste product is carbon dioxide and water. All right, so that means that when you eat, in the process of eating and that immediate meal, the glucose that is in the carbohydrates, glucose is burned immediately. So this is like just pure gasoline. If you were to light that on fire, it lights right away and it's fast. It doesn't last long, but it provides a lot of energy. And if you remember back a few assignments ago, we learned that when you put food in your mouth, the saliva in your mouth actually starts burning and digesting, or it doesn't burn, but it starts digesting the glucose that goes into your mouth. So you can see that glucose is burned immediately. As soon as it gets in our mouth, our body wants to be using it. Now, other things like our fats and proteins, those are going to be more longer term, or they're not as easy to burn. So it's kind of like trying to light a log on fire. It will burn, but it's not easy to burn right away. So when we're not eating between meals, glycogen and also fat are burned. Now, we'll look more at this word glycogen as we move throughout this science notebook page here. But basically, if you don't use glucose, if it's not burned immediately, it gets then stored in glycogen. It becomes glycogen. So the sugars we don't use immediately will be used later, as well as fats. More on that later. Third is storage. So if we're not building new things in our body like proteins and cell membranes, if we're not burning our food for energy, then we're going to store it. We're going to store it for later. So fats are stored as fat. And excess glucose or carbohydrates, the sugars, is stored as, like I was just talking about, glycogen. Unless our glycogen amount is already full. If it's full, then glucose, the sugar we eat, is then stored as fat. So fat is just a way that we store energy in our body so we can burn it later when we don't have any fuel or food at all. Now, actually, you know what else does this? Is amino acids. So when we eat proteins, if we don't use those proteins to build new proteins, then it is stored as glycogen, or it's stored as fat as well. So it turns into fat. So our body is going to store anything that we don't use immediately. And that's why it's so important that if you're putting lots of sugar in your body, that you use that energy up. Otherwise, it gets stored as fat. All right. So now on my next page is where I wrote this next information, because you want a nice big area to write it. And if you're already on a new page, then perfect. But we're going to draw a little diagram to further explore this topic. So between meals, glycogen and fat are burned for energy. Remember, right when we eat that meal, when we're putting that glucose in our body, that carbohydrate glucose, during the meal, we burn it. But between meals, when we're not eating, we still need energy in our body. So that extra sugar in our body is burned, and if there's no extra sugar, then we burn our fat. All right, so the box that I have drawn here is going to represent our glycogen storage. And so we eat sugar, and if the sugar isn't burned, then we store it here in our glycogen storage until our glycogen storage begins to get filled up. And when our glycogen storage fills up, then our body starts to overflow with glycogen. But instead of having glycogen, this is where we get fat from. So our body will store all this extra as our fat. So this here is fat, and it's a lot harder to burn fat, and so we would say that this is our slow energy release. So the glycogen is actually easier to burn, and it's a lot quicker to get that energy. So it's easier and quicker energy, so therefore we burn this first, and after we burn the glycogen, then we burn fat. So it's actually pretty hard to burn your fat. You have to go through all your glucose, all your glycogen, and then your body will start to burn the fat. So if we look at different types of cells, all cells need energy. And so some of the cells that we've talked about can be found in your brain. Some, you actually have fat cells, and those fat cells actually do need energy. Muscle cells, like we've talked about, those need energy. Blood cells need energy. And our liver, which we're learning about now, is a really important organ, also needs energy. So if we look at what do these different organs burn for energy? Well, our brain will burn glucose for energy, or also glycogen for energy. But in an extreme, so if you're like a long distance runner, an extreme exercise, or if you do something for a really long time, in extreme exercise, our brain will actually burn fatty acids. So it will start to burn the fats because it'll run through all the glucose and glycogen. So in extreme exercise will burn fatty acids, or if you are in a starvation type mode, your body will start to burn the fatty acids in our body, or the fat. Fat cells, those burn glucose or glycogen and fatty acids. Our muscles will burn the same thing, glucose or glycogen and fatty acids. Our blood will only burn and use glucose or glycogen. And our liver will burn glucose, glycogen, fatty acids, and actually our liver is able to also burn amino acids from our proteins. So as our body is working, you can see that the glucose and glycogen are really important for giving our body energy. But once it runs out of that, then it goes on and it starts burning our fatty acids. So if you put all this extra stuff in your body and it fills up the glycogen, then you start to produce a lot of extra fat. And that fat will only be used if you can burn through all the sugars that you're putting in your body. Then that extra stuff is going to be burned. So there you have it. We eat, and when we eat, we either build new stuff, we burn it for energy, or we store it for later so we can burn it later. All right, I'm out. See ya.